Now, another thing that brain scanning can look at is individual molecules. These are very limited as to what can be looked at, but one of the molecules that can be looked at is the well-known inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. This is a transmitter that's located throughout the central nervous system. And levels of GABA in the brain have been associated with mood state. So in this particular study that was conducted at Boston University, what they did was they scanned the brains of individuals before and after a single yoga class. So before and after a single yoga class. And they looked at the levels of GABA. And what they found was that after the yoga class, the level of GABA had increased. So again, a very powerful objective measure. And the increase in the level of GABA was correlated very tightly, of course, with mood state. Mood state was improved after the yoga class. So this tells us not only do yoga practices change brain activity, they also change brain biochemistry. The other thing I wanted to share with you is another finding, and the brain is known for having a capacity called neuroplasticity. This is the ability of the brain to change its connections and its actual structure. So people that engage in a certain type of behavior, that region of the brain increases its size in order to accommodate that behavior because more connections are made between neurons. Those neurons require more blood flow, so there's more innervation of blood vessels. They require support cells, glial cells. So that region of the brain actually changes its structure with behavior. So for example, if you start to learn how to juggle, those regions of the brain that are involved in motor coordination and visual coordination of the juggling act, those regions of the brain start to increase in structure. So of course, yoga is a behavioral practice, incorporating postures, breathing, deep relaxation, and meditation. So what can we see in terms of long-term changes in brain structure? And this slide shows figures from a study that was done at our National Institutes of Health. And what they looked at was the tolerance to pain, specifically cold pain in this particular study. And they looked at long-term yoga practitioners and compared them with non-yoga practitioners. The long-term yoga practitioners are in the black dots, and what you can see is that they are clustered at relatively the high end of tolerance to pain, whereas the non-yoga practitioners are clustered at the low end of pain tolerance. In other words, there's something about yoga practice that improves your ability to tolerate pain. The other thing they did at the same time was they did brain scans to measure the volume of the region of the brain that is involved in pain regulation, in this case the insula. And they measured the gray matter volume. And what you can see is that on average, the long-term yoga practitioners had a larger volume of this region of the brain, whereas the non-yoga practitioners had a lower volume in that region of the brain. And on the graph on the right-hand side, this is actually practice dependent. So this is the amount of years that the individual long-term practitioners had practiced yoga. And what you can see is that compared to gray matter volume, there's a tight relationship, such that the longer that they had practiced yoga, the larger that region of the brain was. So this is now telling us that not only can we change brain activity and brain biochemistry, we can also change brain structure. So what's the significance of this? Well, the significance of this is that these are very powerful objective techniques. This now puts us into the realm of modern science and takes away the argument against yoga that it's just a placebo effect, it's just a hobby, it's just a lightweight kind of thing, you know, people imagine that they're getting better, so they're getting better. And our answer to this with this data is no, this is real biology. In fact, these changes in brain activity, structure, and biochemistry are clinically significant, as strong as any drug that you can take. So this is really putting us into the field of real solid evidence behind the effects of yoga on the brain and on the body. Now this cartoon reads, meditation isn't what you think. So there's kind of a double meaning to this cartoon. And of course, the simplest definition of meditation is this focus of attention in a relaxed, non-analytical manner. You focus on the word, or you focus on a mantra, or you focus on your breath. And what happens in the meditation act, of course, is that you hold your focus for a certain period of time, and then suddenly you notice that your mind has wandered off. You start thinking about something else, and then a chain of thought comes on, and then finally a thought occurs to you, you're supposed to be meditating. And so then you release the mind wandering and you come back and you focus your attention. And of course, everyone that meditates experiences this cycle of mental focus and mind wandering, mental focus, mind wandering. Now, that is still beneficial, but in the real world, meditation is not just the focus phase, because we are also mind wandering during meditation. So if you're really going to understand the act of meditation in the real world, we should understand not just the focus phase, we should also understand the mind wandering phase. And this has actually become an area of intensive research. In fact, and this is actually reflected by the Upanishads, where really we have the first sort of definition of meditation. So this is mind wandering here defined. This mind of mind is extremely restless. The mind wanders among objects as a monkey does from tree to tree. Now, of course, nothing has changed in the 2,000 more years that the Upanishads were written. But now, instead of thinking about a monkey, we're probably thinking about an SUV or something more modern. This, I believe, is the first ever definition of meditation. The man who has a discriminating intellect as his driver and a controlled mind as the reins reaches the end of that path at supreme state of Vishnu. This is done as an analogy, suggesting there's a benefit to the focus of attention. And the analogy is to a charioteer driving horses. The horses are the thoughts. If you stand in the chariot and let the horses go where they want, you don't get to go anywhere. But if you hold the reins, if you focus the attention, you get to go somewhere and you get benefit from that chariot. So this is the idea here, that the focus of attention has positive benefits.
Hello?
Now, the study of mind wandering is, as I say, an active area of research. Now, this was a paper that was published by a Harvard research team in our most prestigious journal, Science. They studied mind wandering in the general population and found that people's minds wandered frequently regardless of what they were doing. But people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. This is the new finding. This first finding, of course, this was stated in the Upanishads. So clearly there's an emotional cost to allowing our minds to wander excessively. And I think the reason for this is in the content of mind wandering, which is dominated by survival issues. Survival issues are inherently stressful because you don't know the outcome of survival issues. Will I be able to make it to work on time? Will I have enough money to pay the mortgage this month? Will I be able to send my son to university, etc., etc.? So when we allow our minds to wander excessively, we can develop this negative mood state from the chronic stress reaction of our own thought processes. So what happens in meditation is that we focus attention. When we engage the attention networks, mind wandering ceases. So it's kind of like a mind-wandering holiday, if you will. We are free from the mind wandering. There's a sense of peace when we focus our attention. But what is more important is that during the practice of meditation regularly, we are learning a skill of the self-regulation of attention and of thought processes. And this ultimately leads to the realization that we are not our thoughts, that we have what we call metacognition. And this is a very powerful self-regulation state. In fact, we can see this in the brain scanner. These are people meditating in the scanner. During the focus phase of meditation, what's being activated is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is in the frontal regions of the attention networks of the brain. When the mind is wandering, it's a much diffuser collection of regions called the default mode network. And we are starting to understand the neurophysiology of the relationship between these different brain states. For example, we now know that the prefrontal cortex has inhibitory connections with the limbic system, which is responsible for the stress and emotion response. Another area of modern science is molecular biology. This is looking at how genes change their activity in response to behavior. So for example, if you smoke a lot of cigarettes, you are turning on cancer genes that may produce a tumor. However, if you engage in healthy behaviors, you will upregulate the activity of genes that are good for you. So clearly meditation and yoga have positive benefits. We should be able to see changes in gene expression, and that certainly has been observed. So this is a review paper looking at the molecular signature of mind-body interventions, showing that many genes change their activity with practices like mindfulness yoga and the relaxation response. And just to show you one specific study, this was a yogic meditation called Kirtan Kriya, and in this study they showed suppression of the expression of inflammation-related genes and the upregulated expression of genes involved in immune function. So again, we can see this is happening at the cellular molecular level. These practices penetrate the body down to that level in which our genes are actually changing their behavior to accommodate the benefits of these yoga practices. Now, of course, I've talked a lot about stress management, and this is one area that's very strong. It's one of the major reasons that people come to yoga practice. In this survey study, almost 80% of beginners said stress management was one reason they came to yoga. And a lot of research has shown this. So there's a number of reviews. This most recent review revealed that most types of yoga have positive effects on stress reduction in healthy populations. And it's not just in perceived stress, it's in objective measures like the stress hormone cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate, and even blood lipids. Changes in the both branches of the stress response system. And just to show you some individual examples from our research, this was a yoga study done on mostly education professionals and teachers. The black bar is the yoga group showing reductions in perceived stress at the end of a 6-week yoga program maintained at a 2-month follow-up. The control condition, no change. And then resilience to stress increasing at the long-term follow-up, no change in the control condition. We also did a similar program in Harvard Medical School doctors. After 6 weeks of yoga at the hospital, they had reductions in perceived stress that were maintained and improvements in resilience that were maintained. Another thing that changes as you practice yoga is an increase in mind-body awareness through the meditative aspect of yoga. And ultimately, this leads to improvements in mind-body awareness, or what is now known as mindfulness. This is a survey study done in Germany on long-term yoga practitioners showing that those practitioners that practiced at a high level had higher scores of mindfulness than those that practiced at moderate or marginal levels, suggesting there's a tight relationship between yoga practice and the experience of mind-body awareness or mindfulness. We've seen this in short-term studies. So these are the same education professionals showing increases in scores on mindfulness in the yoga group, no change in the control condition, and also in the Harvard physicians, improvements in the mindfulness score maintained, if not even enhanced, at the long-term follow-up. Another thing that yoga ultimately leads to over time is these contemplative states of consciousness. Over the short term, we're seeing this arousal reduction and improvement in physical well-being. This happens within minutes and certainly over a single yoga class. As we practice over weeks and months, we develop the skills of mind-body awareness, resilience to stress, and the ability to self-regulate our internal state. But what many people report after months and years of practice and even after a yoga lifestyle is a psychological or philosophical transformation. People will say things like, yoga changed my life. This is something deeper and more profound. And this is that same German survey showing that spiritual well-being is dependent upon how intense the long-term yoga practitioners are practicing. There's a dose-response effect. The high-level practitioners have the highest scores on spiritual well-being, as are the scores on positive psychological states of hope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning. And we can even see this over the short term. There's an experience of flow during the practice of certain activities. We've studied this in young adult musicians and showed that after 6 weeks of yoga, we can improve the experience of the flow state. So this now brings me to sort of the most important slide, if you will, of my entire presentation. This is a logic model, which really summarizes all of these mechanisms. So yoga, as we're defining it, is not just the postures. It is traditional yoga, which in most studios and practices incorporates the postures, the breathing techniques, the relaxation, and the meditation component. Now, all 4 of these practices together in yoga or independently will improve physical functioning in a box that I've called fitness. These are things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, self-efficacy. Through all 4 of these practices, again, together or independently, improve self-regulation of internal state, especially stress and emotion regulation, which leads to the skills of resilience to stress and equanimity in the faces of the ups and downs of emotions, which leads to an overall psychological self-efficacy. It is largely the meditative component that's responsible for the engagement of the attention networks to increase mind-body awareness or mindfulness, which improves cognition, concentration, and ultimately leads to this very powerful state we call metacognition. And metacognition really is the topic that Patanjali's Yoga Sutras really are talking about, is this idea of self-regulation of thought processes. And then finally, a phenomenon that happens typically over longer practice, largely through the meditative experiences, this induction of the unitive state during meditation, experiences of transcendence, flow, which leads many people to this deeper transformation and a change in life meaning and purpose. And one thing you can see from this is that we're making changes from the gross level of connective tissue and muscle all the way to the deepest experiences that humans have. And the evidence is really strong for this box here because this is very objective measures. We know this is very concrete and very real. And over the past 2 decades, we've seen enormous research with this modern technology to really tell us about how self-regulation and mind-body awareness are participating in human functioning. And the least amount of research at this point in time, at least, is done on spirituality. But because of this broad spectrum of changes over a wide range of human functioning, we see changes in global human functionality, all the way from the gross level of physical, mental health, and performance to the deeper levels of stress and emotion regulation, awareness and mindfulness, and ultimately metacognition. And finally, for long-term practice, positive behavior changes, well-being, values, life purpose and meaning, and what we can call pure spirituality. So the beauty of this model is that it's based upon modern biomedical science. Not only that, it gives us a language that we can now describe how yoga works. So when you're caught in the elevator for this proverbial 5-minute elevator talk that someone asks you, I know you practice yoga, how does it work? Now instead of using yoga language about prana and chakras and kundalini, now you can start talking about respiratory function, flexibility, stress and emotion regulation, resilience, mind-body awareness, and even transcendence. This puts us into the language of modern medicine, which happens to be the language of modern society. So this is the kind of language that we need, and this is the kind of job that I'm doing in much of my work in promoting the knowledge that we have of research to yoga practitioners and teachers so that they can spread this more effectively throughout our modern society. So a lot of the research that I've shown you was supported in part by the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health. I also work closely with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I'm also the Director of Research for the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports the style of yoga that I practice. And I'm also the Director of Yoga Research for Yoga Alliance. And my role there is exactly what I do in this presentation that I've given you, which is teach about the science behind yoga. We have a number of research videos, a number of research webinars, and a large collection of yoga research citations that have been selected, put on this website, which is free access to everyone. So I'm happy to show this last slide to you. This is where we are at. Actually, in modern society, we're experiencing this epidemic of non-communicable disease, both mental and physical health problems. We do not have the mind-body strategies necessary to prevent this. But yoga, through that logic model, has all of the solutions to the risk factors that are generating these diseases. So if we can do the science, we can change our policy in terms of the implementation of yoga into mainstream society, into our schools, into the healthcare system, and into the workplace, and hopefully change this over time to a better looking outcome in this cartoon here. And the last thing I wanted to do, and have been asked to do here, is to share with you the course that I'm going to be giving at the Vivekananda Yoga University. And this is a course that basically will take this one lecture and spread it over an entire course. And I want to share with you the outline for the course in terms of the lectures that will be offered. So we will start with an introduction to biomedical yoga research in general, an understanding of how biomedical research works, what the characteristics are, and the unique characteristics of yoga research itself. We'll talk about demographic research on yoga. The survey studies have been done, the barriers to research, the reasons for adoption of yoga practices, the demographics of who it is that's practicing yoga, the percentages of the population. And then we'll do what I just did in this talk, which would be to talk about the basic research about what's the research on the exercises, the asanas and the relaxation practices. What's the research on pranayama and what's the research on meditation? What's the research on yoga as a whole when it's offered together, independent of these four components of yoga? And then we'll go into yoga therapy research, which is a large and growing body of research. We'll look at physical and health performance, disease prevention. We'll talk about special populations like prisons and schools and workplaces. We'll talk about mental health and spirituality, and then a number of very clinical conditions, mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, cardiorespiratory and metabolic diseases, cancer and musculoskeletal diseases. And then we will engage the students as well in projects that have them working on a personal practice and then have them apply research metrics to their practice, and these will be presented to the whole class as student presentations as part of the course evaluation. So it's not just the academic component, there will be a very real practice component that's involved in this course and a research component that's involved in this course to really bring home how yoga research is done and what the benefits are. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention.